but at the wrong time, for example, after death. That is, necrophilia, having sex with a dead human body. That's number one. Okay, so in this course, we are talking so far about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, you'll remember, was the theory that we are morally required to do whatever action will produce the greatest total of pleasure minus pain. The author that we have so far been reading that represents utilitarianism, he defends it and argues in its favor, was Jeremy Bentham. And most recently, we were talking about Bentham's attempt to explain how utilitarianism feels about the idea of punishment. The thought is, well, the utilitarian thought was, look, punishment is bad. You should only punish in cases where not punishing is even worse, because punishment always causes some pain, and pain is the thing that you want to minimize according to the utilitarian. But the thought is sometimes punishing one person who genuinely committed a crime will result in less pain for them and everyone else further in the future, or something like that. Okay, so that's the utilitarian theory of punishment very broadly. For today, we read the first few pages of a fascinating 60-page long essay published in written, I think, in 1785, and then I think it wasn't published until 1787 or 1788 or 1789 or something like that, but written in 1785, and the name of this essay is Offenses Against Oneself. This essay, written in 1785, is the first known instance where someone in the English language ever, in writing, defended the claim that homosexual sex should not be illegal and punished by law. This is the first time anyone did it ever, and Bentham was the one. Okay, so he's claiming that a certain kind of behavior, supposedly offenses or things that are supposedly bad that you do to yourself, right? Those things should not be punished. The government shouldn't put you in prison for having consensual sexual relations with another person. That's the claim of this essay, and it's 60 pages long, and we only read the first few pages. I want to note one thing before we start. I suspect that, in this part of the 21st century, it wasn't always the case. I mean, when I was in high school, I think that, gay marriage was not legal in any states. And then when I was in college, it became legal in one state, right? That's a different part of the evolution of gay rights or whatever, or LGBT rights more broadly. But anyway, so the movement has been quick and recent in favor of gay rights. But maybe you agree with this essay, right? Probably you think that gay sex should not be grounds for putting someone in prison. Okay, maybe you think that. If you do, right, then you should just note the power of a broad ethical theory to reach forward in time, way ahead of its time, absurdly ahead of its time. In 1785, there were not really properly functioning toilets in existence on the planet. So this was some time ago, right? And Bentham was way ahead of his time, and it was because he had a big, coherent, or mostly coherent, moral or ethical theory. And I think the existence of this essay can count for some as a sort of argument in favor of doing this kind of ethics. So let me explain a little bit more of what I mean before we jump into some of the details of this essay. This lecture that you're watching now, as you know, is part of a course, called Introduction to Ethics. Now, this course deals with big, broad ethical theories, like utilitarianism and other ethical theories, right? There's a Kantian ethical theory, Kantianism. It's called deontology or deontological moral theory, right? We're going to talk about big ethical theories like that. There's another course that you could take that every philosophy department or almost every philosophy department in the world offers, something that might be called applied ethics. Or it might be called something like, contemporary moral issues or something like that. This kind of a course deals not with big, grand ethical theories that say what makes an action right in general or wrong in general. This kind of a course deals with specific moral questions like, the moral permissibility or impermissibility of abortion or genetic modification, or the death penalty, or immigration. These are very specific moral questions, and these general theories will, in some cases, yield results about these specific questions. You might think that this is the only stuff worth talking about. Let's just get into the details. Let's just talk straight away about whether abortion is morally permissible or morally prohibited, right? Let's just talk immediately and directly about whether the death penalty is legitimate or illegitimate from a moral standpoint. And you can do that. You can jump right into it. And actually, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. But there is an incredible value in spending some time doing this activity, talking about these big general moral theories. Because what they can do sometimes is they can reach way into the future and get a result about one of these specific questions that no one else at the time was getting. That's what's going on in this case, right? Whether you agree with Bentham or not, maybe you think that homosexual sex should be illegal and people who engage in this kind of sex should be put in prison. Maybe you think that, okay? But you have to admit, even if you do think that, right? And that's a very unpopular opinion today. I mean, some people think that, gay marriage shouldn't be recognized by the state, right? But they almost never think that a consensual sexual act should land someone in prison. Anyway, okay, but even if you do think that, right, you have to admit that there is something impressive about a moral theory that just sort of holds its ground on something that is very unpopular during its time, right? If you oppose this essay, then you hold an opinion that's very unpopular during your time. So you have to respect Bentham and his utilitarian principles in some sense. The existence of this essay, and this is the last time I'll say it, and we'll get into the details, is a kind of argument for the usefulness of this sort of course, the course that this lecture is a part of. Okay, let's start by just talking about the first paragraph of this essay. The text is difficult, I admit that, so we're going to go through it slowly. To what class of offenses shall we refer the irregularities of the venereal appetite, which are styled unnatural? That's the opening question. That's the question that he opens with. That is, how should we categorize these supposed offenses, this type of behavior? How should we categorize this type of behavior, specifically the irregularities of the venereal appetite? Venereal means sexual, appetite means appetite or desire. So the unusual types of sexual desire that are called or styled, they're labeled unnatural. So there are some unusual instances of sexual desire that people call unnatural. We're talking, about several, but gay sexual desire is one of them. To what category of offenses shall we refer them? That is, how should we categorize them as offenses? And then he gives the answer. When hidden from the public eye, that is, when these sorts of sexual acts are done in private, when they're done in private, there could be no color for placing them anywhere else anywhere else, anywhere other than a certain place. They've got to go in a certain place, and if they don't go, there's no reason to put them in any other place. Could they find a place anywhere, it would be here. That is, if we could fit these kinds of offenses anywhere, it's going to be here. Where the hell is here? Well, the answer is it's not anywhere in the essay previous. It's not anywhere from the beginning of the essay. It's actually all the way back up all the way at the top, which is the title. He's talking here about the title, offenses against oneself. So if these are going to be offenses at all, they're going to be offenses that you commit against yourself because you're doing it in private. You're not hurting anyone else. The other person involved, given that it's consensual, enjoys the activity. Okay, so we're talking about offenses against oneself, if there really are such offenses, and whether or not those offenses should be punished. He says, I have been tormenting myself for years to find, if possible, a sufficient ground for treating them, these types of offenses, these acts. I have been torturing myself for years to find, if possible, a sufficient ground for treating them with the severity with which they are treated at this time of day by all European nations. That is, I've been trying to figure out what justification there could be for punishing these acts so severely, with such severe punishments as they are punished these days, right, in all European nations. And then he says, but upon the principle of utility, I can find none. According to the principle of utility, which says that you should do whatever act, you must do whatever act or whatever behavior is going to result in the greatest total of pleasure minus pain, according to the principle of utility, there is no justification for punishing this type of behavior in the way that it's punished these days, with imprisonment and torture and death in some cases, in many cases. That's the claim that he makes in the first paragraph. Then, in the second paragraph of this essay, the other one that I want to talk about in a little bit of detail, he lists not just gay sex, but other supposed offenses against oneself or other irregularities of the venereal appetite. So we get a list of them. But when he lists these, he can't just come out and give the sort of common colloquial names for them, because there's something uncouth about naming these activities so explicitly. So he has to put it in a sort of cagey way. And I suspect that many students, when they read these sentences, don't immediately know what he's talking about. So it's worth just going through them. I think there are 5. Yeah, there are 5 types of sexual activity that Bentham lists. He numbers the list 1 through 5. So we're going to go through this list, and we're going to figure out what he's talking about in each case. Okay, so we're going to go through these. Part of the reason I'll just say that it's worth going through these is that when I teach this material in an actual classroom, what always happens is that I sort of ask the class very generally, okay, does everyone understand what he's talking about in all 5 of these? And everyone nods, yeah. No one raises their hand and says they don't understand. But then we go through them, and there's always a few audible gasps when someone actually understands what he's talking about. And so that proves that people don't know what's really going on. And it's worth, if this was assigned reading, it's worth going through it and making sure that you understand it. And also it's kind of fun because you get to figure out that he's talking about something very taboo in sort of very proper technical language that sort of hides exactly what he's talking about. But let's go through. We're talking about 5 types of sexual behavior. That's what this is. That all count as offenses against oneself or irregularities of the venereal appetite. Here we go. So, making use of an object, so making sexual use. That's what's going on here. So making sexual use of something of the proper species, but at an improper time. For instance, after death. So the object that you're making sexual use of, the thing that you're having sex with, it's of the right species, It's a human. It's a homo sapien. You're having sex with a homo sapien, but at the wrong time. For example, after death. That is, necrophilia, having sex with a dead human body. That's number one. 2, making use of an object of the proper species and sex, and at a proper time, but in an improper part. What does that mean? It means having sex with a human being of the, well, proper sex, he means here of the opposite sex. So a man having sex with a woman, or a woman having sex with a man, and at a proper time, that is, while they're still alive, but in an improper part. He means improper part of their body. What he has in mind are either oral sex or sodomy or anal sex. That's number 2. 3, of an object, making use of an object of the proper species but the wrong sex. So here he's talking about homosexuality. This is distinguished from the rest by the name pederasty. So actually, pederasty, as it's contemporarily used, this term, if it's ever really used these days at all, I think usually means sex between an older man and a young boy. It never refers to sex between 2 women, and it typically doesn't refer to sex between 2 adult men of roughly the same age. But anyway, we know how he's using the term. He's using the term for any kind of gay sex. That's 3. We've got 3 irregularities of the venereal appetite so far. Necrophilia, oral or anal sex, or 3, gay sex. Here we go. 4, of a wrong species, making use, sexual use, of a wrong species. Here he means like biological species. He means bestiality, having sex with animals, non-human animals. That's 4. Or 5, in procuring this sensation by oneself without the help of any other sensitive object. What does that mean? What is 5 talking about? He's talking about masturbation. Procuring this sensation, that is a sexual sensation or orgasm or whatever, right? Procuring this sensation by oneself, by yourself. Doing that by yourself, without the help of any other sensitive object. Sensitive here means having sensations, right? So if you have sex with a person, that person has sensations and you have sensations. You're both, that person is a sensitive object. They have sensations too. But if you procure your sensation by use of some object that doesn't have sensations of its own, by use of some tool or apparatus, right? Then, well, that falls under category number 5 of irregularities of the venereal appetite. Okay, we made it through that. This essay is mostly about number 3. But really, the kinds of claims that Bentham is making apply to all 5, and therefore make things a little more controversial. When I teach this in the classroom, or even when I teach this online, and we then have a discussion on a discussion board, number 1 is always somewhat controversial. Bentham thinks that according to the principle of utility, we shouldn't be punishing number 1. Now, you might point out that, look, necrophilia involves a lack of consent because the person that you are having sex with, in that case, doesn't consent to the act because they're dead, or doesn't typically consent to the act. They didn't consent to it when they were alive, typically. But Bentham doesn't care about consent. He cares about utility. He cares about pleasure and pain. Consent matters for Bentham sometimes, almost always maybe. Maybe he claims always. It always matters. But it matters only because it results in something else, which is pleasure, and it avoids something else, which is pain. In the case of necrophilia, Bentham is controversially, even today, going to say, look, if it doesn't cause pain for anyone, then it's not a bad thing to do. And if it causes pleasure, then it's a good thing to do. Okay, so that was a little controversial part. But if we put that aside and focus mostly on what Bentham calls pederasty, or we could call just gay sex, we can see how the utilitarian gets the result that, well, that activity should not be punished. There's one last thing that I want to sort of mention about this essay, and that's how it fits with the previous writing of Bentham that we've been talking about in this course. Previously, even for the last meeting of this class, the last lecture or whatever, we were talking about a different work of Bentham called Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. That was where he presents, his general defense of utilitarianism, as opposed to a specific defense about this specific moral issue. In that larger piece, when he's talking about punishment, he lists 4 cases where he thinks that, according to utilitarianism, punishment shouldn't be done. These kinds of behaviors are sometimes punished, but they shouldn't be. What I want to do is list out these 4. These are the 4 cases where a utilitarian thinks that some act should not be punished. List out these 4, and then see which one Bentham thinks, gay sex falls into. Okay, so these are the 4 cases, and we're going to go through each of these. As we go through them, think to yourself, where does it make sense for Bentham to put pederasty or sodomy? Okay, let's go through the 4 of these and I'll remind you what they each mean. Do not punish, so according to utilitarianism, you're not supposed to punish when the punishment is or would be one of the following. 1, groundless. That is, when the action being punished is not actually bad, right? There's no grounds for punishing when the thing you're punishing is not actually a bad thing to do. 2, inefficacious. That is, the punishment wouldn't have the desired effect. It wouldn't prevent any future bad actions. 3, unprofitable. A punishment is unprofitable when the cost of that punishment exceeds the benefit. That is, when the punishment is so severe, it causes so much pain, according to the utilitarian, that even though this punishment will prevent a certain kind of pain, it will prevent this bad action that's being punished from happening again and again, the punishment is so severe that it'll cause more pain than it will prevent. In that case, the punishment is unprofitable. 4, needless. The punishment is needless when something else, some less bad thing other than the punishment, is going to prevent this action from happening again anyway. Okay, those are the 4 cases where some behavior should not be punished, according to the utilitarian. Where does gay sex fit? According to Bentham, it fits here. Punishment of homosexuality is, Bentham thinks and argues in this essay, it's groundless. That is, the action itself is not a bad thing. And Bentham's argument for this is very simply that, look, if it's consensual, and that's of course the only thing he's talking about, he says very clearly that when it's not consensual, it is an offense totally different in its nature and effects. It is a personal injury. It is a kind of rape. But if it is consensual, well then it's being enjoyed, or in general is enjoyed, by both parties. And so it's not actually a bad thing to do. So punishing it is groundless. There's no grounds for punishing it. That's Bentham's claim. He made this claim all the way back in 1785.